This comic page is terrifying. But what actually makes it terrifying? There's actually a huge amount of very specific techniques happening here just below the surface that are acting on your subconscious. That's because this page was drawn by Junji Ito, and the entire time you're reading one of Junji Ito's comics, you are being manipulated. See, early in his life, this adorable cat-loving man discovered a repeatable formula for creating terrifying works of comic art, and has used that same formula for over 30 years to create a staggering amount of brilliant, terrifying works and to become the god of horror. And the first technique in that formula should be obvious to anyone looking at this page. Can you see it? If you read a lot of manga, it may actually be harder to spot. This page comes from the first chapter of his epic masterpiece, Uzumaki. And in this opening chapter, he uses the same technique again here and here. Any guesses? Okay, it might help to contrast this with American comics. In American comics, we generally see the same amount of detail across an entire comic, from panel to panel and from subject to subject. But in manga, characters are often drawn with varying levels of detail, and sometimes at different levels of detail than the backgrounds and other objects. See, to the thoughtful artist, the amount of detail isn't just an inherent part of their style, but a tool for storytelling. And Ito has mastered using that tool to create terror. We'll get back to this image, but to help understand why this is so psychologically powerful, let me borrow a visual from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. This chart represents a simplified spectrum of the different levels of detail an artist can use to represent a character, from extremely simplified on one end to photorealistic on the other. Why this matters is when we look at this simple face over here, it doesn't represent anyone in particular. It could be you, it could be me. Many comic strips and webcomics primarily use this type of symbolic representation because we're supposed to project ourselves into these panels rather than seeing characters from the artist's imagination. On the other side of this spectrum is realistic or representational styles. This image is very clearly not me or you, unless you're Nicolas Cage watching this video, in which case, Nick, please like and subscribe. When the rest of us look at an image like this, we see the otherness of the subject, not ourselves. Now, all artists have to exist somewhere along this spectrum. Most American superhero comics tend to operate around here-ish, although that has varied a bit over time, but generally we tend to look from outside in on the exploits of these characters, but they're just symbolic enough to allow some degree of self-projection. But something you'll notice in manga is that often the protagonists, the characters we are meant to relate to, are more on the symbolic side of the spectrum, while characters that are villains, mentors, gag characters, the supporting cast tend to be more on the representational side. In this way, the artist invites us to project ourselves onto the protagonist, but to look upon that supporting cast from the outside, just like the protagonist would. It's very clever and allows us to fall deeply into these worlds. So after seeing all that, let's look at this panel again. It seems simple, but if this panel had just been this detailed, grotesque image, it wouldn't have nearly as much power. But it's not just a grotesque image. It's a grotesque image being seen by two characters who are drawn in an exceedingly simple style, barely more than an outline and a few pen strokes. You would think our brains would register the very apparent clash between these two styles, but that's not what our brains do. Instead, just as Ito intends, we instinctively empathize with the wife and son, and that transforms us from being someone that is just looking at a gross image printed on a page into being the son who is looking upon the distorted body of his father. As you look across Ito's work, you'll frequently find the same technique of a ghastly, realistically rendered image on the same page or even in the same panel as a cartoonish, simplistic face reacting to that very image. It's simple and brilliant, but Ito's use of detail doesn't stop there. You see, this idea of simple drawings contrasting with horrific imagery didn't originate with Ito. Ito borrows it from his biggest influence, Kazuo Umezz. I'm doing my best on pronunciation today. Ito discovered Umezz when he was only 5 years old. His sisters had given him a copy of Umezz's Mummy Teacher, which I assume was a prank meant to traumatize him, but instead it got him totally hooked and began his journey to become a master of horror. You see, Umezz was in the process of basically inventing horror manga. Working primarily in shoujo magazines that targeted young girls, his initial stories were not actually horror stories. But in 1965, he began on a trilogy of stories that is now called Reptilia, in which classic 60s shoujo characters come up against a ghastly snake woman. Does this contrast of cartoonish stock characters up against ghoulish, detailed supernatural forces remind you of anyone? Young Ito fell hard for Umezz, and as early as 6 or 7, Ito began drawing his own manga imitating Umezz's style. And Ito wasn't the only one obsessed. Reptilia was a huge hit and started a boom in horror manga across the country. And as Ito grew up, so did the popularity and sophistication of horror manga. When Ito was 11 years old, Umezz began on what is generally considered his masterpiece, The Drifting Classroom. Young Ito became so obsessed with with the Drifting Classroom that he actually drew his own 12th volume to continue the story after it was over. Even today, he considers it the largest influence on his work. And I think it's directly from Umezz that Ito draws this next technique in his formula, which was not only varying the detail between the characters, but between the characters and the worlds they inhabit in very specific ways. In both Ito's Uzumaki and Umezz's Drifting Classroom, these cartoonish protagonists inhabit a relatively realistic landscape. And while Umezz and Ito figured out how to use that technique in their formula for terror, it actually dates back further and is fairly common in manga thanks to the influence of two men: the Walt Disney of Japan, Osamu Tezuka, and the Walt Disney of America, Walt Disney. Bear with me on this. The method of producing early Disney films involved photographing a succession of hand-drawn characters on transparent sheets in front of static painted backdrops, which gave this effect of a cartoon character living in a realistic painted world. This may have been a technical necessity for Disney or a creative choice and was probably a mix of the two, but the resulting images are inarguably powerful and set the tone not only for decades of animation, but also for the entire manga industry. Why? Because of Tezuka. Someday I'll be able to afford a translator and make a full Tezuka video, but his influence on the development of manga, as well as his ability to unironically rock a beret, cannot be overstated. Young Tezuka was an absolute Disney fanatic. He famously saw Bambi more than 80 times, and so a few years later, when he's basically inventing manga, he borrowed Disney's style, placing his cartoonish characters in more realistic settings, setting the tone for the thousands of manga artists who would see him as their main inspiration. One of those young artists was Umezz, and just as he had with his work in the shoujo magazines in the 60s, Umezz applied that classical manga technique to horror. He took his ultra-simplified characters and placed them in realistic, well-detailed, oftentimes horrific landscapes. I mean, the Drifting Classroom is about an entire elementary school that gets transported into an alternate dimension, and the entire book could just be a case study in the contrast of detail. He plays out his dark drama of innocent, almost cute drawings of children against the more well-rendered drawings of the adults in a world that is realistic, rectilinear, claustrophobic, and then breaks apart into pure painterly abstraction. Can you tell I really like the Drifting Classroom? Umezz needs his own video, but let's bring this all back to Ito for now. Because Ito, absorbing all of this at like 12 years old, would take all of Umezz's innovations in the Drifting Classroom to new heights. See, Ito grew up in a remote part of Japan and has spent most of his life there, and I think that lends all of his stories a real awareness of a sense of place. Unlike other manga artists who often use interchangeable cityscapes, abstract backgrounds that imply motion or emotion, or dispense with backgrounds entirely in favor of readability, Ito grounds almost all of his stories in very tangible locations. So let's go back to that opening chapter of Uzumaki, starting back at the beginning. We were introduced to Kiri and her friend Shuichi, two high schoolers in this small town. While the foreground action of these pages involves Kiri telling us about her life and learning from Shuichi about his father's strange obsession with spirals, these scenes don't take place just anywhere. We begin on a high vista and have this beautiful rendition of the town, and then we gradually sink further in, going down the forest path, through the crowded streets, looking down the dense alleyways, hanging out in an empty playground. It's all very intentional. Because the foreground characters are simple, we're encouraged to read quickly, to move along with the dialogue, but the realistic backgrounds surround us, so as we empathize with the characters and become engaged with the story, we're subconsciously sinking deeper into this world that Ito has created. But this whole video isn't about realism, because if Ito had stopped the development of his formula there, he would just be another imitator of Umezz. But as a teenager, he began to look outside of Japan for influences, to an Italian filmmaker, an American writer, and a Swiss painter. The two movies Ito most references being influenced by growing up were The Exorcist and Suspiria. And while The Exorcist is great, I think it's Dario Argento's influence that really shows up in his work. Now, I could easily talk for a while about Italian horror films, but I'll just oversimplify and say that what often characterizes these films is the abundance of mean, graphic violence that is presented in shockingly beautiful ways. It's like a hybridization of Italian artsy directors like Fellini, Antonioni, and Bertolucci with the gory, oftentimes ugly American horror films of the early 70s. In Suspiria, maybe the most dramatic example of this mixture of beauty and ugliness. And this tracks with something that Ito has said. I enjoy drawing both extremes, extremely ugly or extremely beautiful. And Ito's use of formal beauty is something we don't see a lot in Umezz's work. Ito talks about using the golden ratio to draw attractive faces, the influence he's taken from Degas, Vermeer, and Dali. But that attention to beauty is part of his formula for terror, because when the ugliness finally arrives, it seems so much uglier by contrast. So let's talk about that ugliness. Because while Italian horror generally draws a lot of its ugliness from blood and guts, Ito generally avoids that. He was looking for a deeper deeper source of fear, and that is when he discovered H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's work often focuses on these massive, incomprehensible forces and the effect they have on our fragile human minds. Ito describes how after discovering Lovecraft, the scale of what he found horrific grew bigger, that the universe is terrifying, that the scariest things are those that are so large and abstract that they're beyond human comprehension. And Ito wanted to capture that visually, but it was actually a fellow Lovecraft fan who showed him the way, Hans Rudy Geiger. Geiger is probably best known today for his influence and design work on the film Alien, but his body of work is actually much deeper and larger. Geiger's paintings are obviously disturbing, but not because they show gore or even familiar terrifying images, but because they show recognizably human features being distorted and perverted, often in uncomfortable, mechanical, unfamiliar ways. It's a visual merging of the relatable with the abstract, and it's hard to not feel uncomfortable just looking at it. They pulse with an almost cosmic, overwhelming feeling, just like Lovecraft. This parallel to Lovecraft is more than mere coincidence. The original painting that inspired Alien is titled Necronom 4, from a series of works Geiger named after Lovecraft's Necronomicon. So Ito would adopt Geiger's approach to visualizing Lovecraft's version of terror by focusing on uncomfortable, unrealistic distortions of the human body to express deeper, uncomfortable, universal human fears. And watching these interviews, he's so conscious of that. Like, I'm struck by this clip of him on a Japanese TV show where he's drawing a mouth with 20 rows of teeth and just goes, "Oh, it wouldn't look like that." He's fully aware of the literal, realistic way to depict something, but is choosing the emotional, psychological approach to his distortions of the human body. And what's even more interesting is that Ito would have a better grasp of how to draw actual anatomy than most of his peers, because he'd studied anatomy in college. You see, after graduating high school, despite his obsession with horror manga, Umezz, horror films, and art, he decided to go to school to become a dental technician. How will that work out for him? We'll come back to that, but let's get back to Uzumaki. We left off with Shuichi's father becoming progressively more obsessed with spirals. So what does he do? He begins turning his body into a spiral, of course. First, by spinning his eyes quickly, and then by transforming his tongue. But just how that is depicted is very specific, and brings us to the next item on our list, which is how Ito creates motion in his comics. Another quick crib from Scott McCloud here. There are in general two ways that comics, a static medium, can simulate motion. One is within a panel. This includes things like speed lines, motion blur, split images, and a bunch of other creative techniques. The other approach to motion in comics is by having two panels next to each other in which the reader is invited to create the motion by connecting those panels in their mind. Or in the case of Ito, the reader is forced, probably against their will, to create that motion in their mind. Because look at this tongue sequence again. I imagine many artists staring at a blank page and conceiving how to illustrate a scene of a guy sticking his tongue out in a spiral would just slap this panel down and call it a day. Not Ito though. He wants to hijack your brain's need to connect these panels, and so he breaks that single action down into 4 distinct panels. It's like the comic equivalent of slow motion, forcing you to linger and create in your own mind the pace, the sound, the feel of that tongue. So we know how Ito uses detail, motion, beauty, and ugliness to create terror, but to bring it all together, Ito turns to a manga artist who has sadly largely been forgotten in America, Hideshi Hino. Today, Hino may be most well known for directing a horror film so realistic that after a friend lent him a VHS copy, Charlie Sheen thought he'd watched a real murder on tape and called the authorities, prompting an FBI investigation. But weird trivia aside, Hino is actually an incredibly gifted manga artist, part of the horror manga boom that followed in Umezz's wake, and someone Ito likely would have been reading as he began his career as a dental technician. But Hino is kind of Umezz's opposite. Where something like The Drifting Classroom is psychological and existential, Hino's work is much more yucky. Ito has said that Hino's use of shockingly cruel images inspired him, but what really jumps out at me is not the images themselves, but how they are presented. Let's take a look at one of Hino's more well-known stories, at least in America, called Hell Baby. On the first page of this sequence, a doctor is telling a father that something is wrong with his newly born daughter. If you know Hino, you know he's going to show us something disgusting. So then you turn the page, only for more buildup. Then the father says, "Take me to see her now," and you turn the page expecting to see something horrific, but still, Hino draws it out. Then 2 pages later, we see the father walk in and the doctor says, "In this room, we have your second-born child." The final panel is a reaction shot, and we turn the page to see another page of buildup as the father approaches, and we get a little closer and we turn, zooming in on the father's face, and finally we turn the page to see a double-page spread of the baby. And yes, it's disgusting, but it's been turned from a gross image into horror because Hino has manipulated our emotions, playing with the fact that we know something terrible is coming, increasing our dread of turning each page, creating horror in a way that only the comic medium can. So let's turn back to Uzumaki once again to see how Ito has made Hino's approach to horror part of his own. Ito begins the final sequence moments of this chapter with an ominous delivery arriving at Shuichi's house, and then flashes to his father's funeral, with Shuichi telling Kiri that his father had finally died from his obsession with spirals. For a moment, we think maybe we're out of the woods, Ito isn't going to show us anything terrifying, but then we flash back. Ito even ends one page with a fake-out reaction shot that could have been leading into a horrific image, only to subvert it, just like Hino does. And then on this page, he uses dense composition to slow down time, a full 6 panels in which only a few moments pass, and then we look up from inside the tub at the growing fear in those relatable faces, and then finally, we turn the page. So Ito has it almost all pulled together. There's just one final piece missing. So let's return to Ito's own life. Because when we last left him, he was working as a dental technician. He dabbled in manga as a hobby, but had moved away from it as a career. But then he sees something in one of the manga magazines he reads. Monthly Halloween, a newer magazine dedicated to shoujo horror, is holding a contest. They're giving out the Umezz Prize for horror manga, and it's going to be judged by Umezz himself. And Ito's inspired, not to win the contest, but to know that his hero, Umezz, the man who inspired him since he was 5 years old, would read his work. So he spends the little free time he has drawing a 30-page story. And that story is Tomie. Not only did he win the Umezz Prize, the story was so popular that Monthly Halloween offered Ito a job to continue publishing manga. And no joke, he has to think about it. He likes being a dental technician, but ultimately he decides to change careers and become a manga artist. He continues Tomie at a huge success. It's eventually turned into a multi-part movie series, and he's continued from then until now, building up an incredible body of work. So I'll put a reading guide below to help you navigate. But what's the final part of his formula? Well, in every interview I found with him, he's incredibly humble and deeply focused on his craft. He sits in the same house, at the same desk, with no assistants, with tools that he's made and modified himself, working slowly, methodically, and thoughtfully to give us all terrible, terrible nightmares. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting down below. And please let me know in the comments if you're Nicolas Cage.